Welcome everyone to the Wheeler Centre and to part 3 of the Rite of Passage series, Growing Pains. Well, it is no surprise that this event sold out so early on, and well done to you early birds. When you look at our 3 panellists who are here to talk about the category of YA as a roadmap towards adulthood. Their writing has been so strongly endorsed by teenagers. Will Kostakis won the Gold Inky Award. That's the Teen Choice Award presented by the Centre for Youth Literature last year with his funny and incredibly touching second novel, The First Third. His first novel was Loathing Lola, written when he was just 19. We'll talk about that later. Alice Pung started early too with her spectacular memoir, Unpolished Gem. And she is shortlisted for the Gold Inky this year with her debut novel, Laurinda. And John Marsden, where do I begin? Over 40 books, most of those for teenagers, over 5 million sales. And my ex-colleagues at Readings Books, some of whom are here tonight, I think, described to me how they used to pass around John Marsden books from friend to friend in high school. And I think there is really no finer endorsement than that. Please welcome our guests. So we're here tonight because we're all really interested in that testing period of time that has so many universal traits to it, and we want to explore how YA fiction could be one of the tools in the survival kit, if you like. To set the tone, John is going to read a very fitting paragraph from a book that I know broke many hearts and still is breaking many hearts. It's from Checkers.
This is the second time this year I've had to read my own work aloud in public, and I really find it difficult, but I'll see how I go. Life seems so fragile. You walk down the centre of the highway with the big trucks rushing past. They make the air shake. They blow you off your line. You stick out your arms to get your balance. A truck hits one arm and spins you around. You stagger and fall, holding your arm and crying. Another truck rushes at you. There's no escape. Your body is just bones and flesh, that's all. There are too many things beating at you, blowing at you, hurting you, and leaving bruises. It's a miracle anyone survives to be a teenager. It's a miracle any teenager survives to be an adult.
Well, John, that leaves us in no doubt as to how tough the teenage years can be from their perspective. Do you remember feeling that way as a teenager about life?
Oh, yeah, totally. It was an awful time. But it should also be acknowledged that many teenagers go through their adolescence gracefully and good-humouredly and apparently successfully. And so that's a very...
I don't think she believes you.
No, that's the kind of laugh Malcolm Turnbull got on Saturday at the New South Wales Liberal Conference when he said that there were no factions in the Liberal Party. And but no, I think a lot of them do navigate that difficult course very skillfully. But there are certainly a number who find it incredibly stressful and traumatic and very hard work.
And those sorts of very strong images that are throughout your work are really what teenagers have connected so strongly with, aren't they?
Yeah, I guess. I mean, there's things that I try to do. I don't even consciously try to do them, but I just do them unconsciously, I suppose. And one of them is to treat teenage issues as important and treat the teenage years as important, and to treat the state of teenagehood as something that can be regarded with respect and regarded as a serious episode in one's life. And there is a sort of mocking tone that many adults take towards teenagers when they fall in love, for example, and it's quite unpleasant. Or jokes about the way their bodies smell, or about the fact that they're growing bigger, and with boys their voices might be breaking, they might be getting moustaches or needing to shave, and all that stuff becomes often the subject of kind of sardonic responses from adults, which are quite cruel and quite unhelpful.
So, guys, do you think as a society we take teenagers seriously? Is that part of the job of the young adult author, as you see it, based on what John said?
I think we do and we don't. We do in literature because teenagers at schools are reading King Lear from Shakespeare, they're reading Jane Austen, they're reading great classics that deal with themes of life and death and loss and liberty. and yet in society we don't treat them like they have these ideas. For me, teenagers are adults without the rights and responsibilities as adults. In other cultures, you come of age, you reach puberty, you're treated like an adult. We have this massive paradox where we give them the ideas of adulthood and we take away their freedoms until they're 18, and then they're thrust into the world, and terrible things happen. There's a disjuncture in your psyche when you have that sudden thrusting into the world, when you've never had these rights and responsibilities, I guess. And this frustration, you've got adult thoughts and you don't have any power at times as a teenager.
And so you believe that books can be a part of our sort of survival kit. And can you remember books from your teenage years that provided that role?
Yeah, John's books provided that role very well, because people didn't expect me to have this. I was a bit angry as a teenager, but I never acted angry because I looked after my younger sisters quite well. We grew up in Braybrook behind all these factories, which was quite disheartening. But you used to get socialised with your girl cousins and with your girls at the Catholic school to be nice. That's how girls get socialised. So John's books were a great outlet. I thought, hey, this is how I feel. And they were good in that I didn't go and, inflict violence on anyone or on myself, which sometimes you feel like doing as a teenager, don't you?
Absolutely. Will, what books do you remember from your teenage years?
For me, it was... I remember Morris Gleitzman, especially from that, awkward 12 to 13 stage. Like, my parents are getting divorced and I'm like, oh, woe is me. Oh, there's puppy fat. And, oh, people are talking about sex. Oh, there's bum face. And I seem to have grown up in that, I don't want to call it Morris's glory years because I'm sure kids now would say his books, they're his glory years. But for me, I seem to hit the right Morris book at exactly the right time and for the exact age. So it was like he was writing specifically for me. And then when I met him, he was like, who are you? I'm like, yay. But, for me, it was like I knew him intimately and I felt that he was reflecting my life. And then it was funny that you mentioned the texts that we give kids to read in high school, because the funny thing is I remember if anyone here was at Reading Matters this year, when we were talking about the text that we choose for the VCE, the idea of putting a young adult text on the list was like, oh no, that's not, that's not higher order and that sort of thing. It was like, it was as if because the subject matter was teen and because it had teenage protagonist, it was somehow unworthy of study and things like that. But, for me it was as much, look, I will confess to be, I don't want to say nerd, but, I loved reading. But I fell off the reading bandwagon because I was too busy reading the higher order texts I had to read for school. But then come to year 11 and year 12, I discovered Barry Johnsberg and his the whole business with Kiffo and the Pitbull. And, it's not all about you, karma. It was just this really strong voice. And I was like, wow, this guy, he's writing and it sounds like me. It sounds like people that I know now. And that was such a powerful thing because it gave my thoughts and my feelings validation, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. John, books from your childhood, your teenage
The Catcher
years?
in the Rye was the only one there was.
Yeah,
yeah, that was mine too.
Yeah, there was no such thing as adolescent fiction. So you went from Enid Blyton to Thomas Hardy, and that was a big jump. And I couldn't really make that jump. So I filled the gap with the ripping yarns of people like Hammond Innes and Alistair MacLean and Desmond Bagley and Ian Fleming, which are ostensibly written for adults, but which really are adolescent in so many ways. But Catcher in the Rye, I didn't even notice the symbols and the kind of abstract notions that were being explored by Salinger. The voice was so intoxicating and so seductive and so shocking and so exhilarating that that was all I noticed. I was like, holy shit, this guy thinks and talks like I do, and is it legal to write a book like this? I was really puzzled. It was like listening to Bob Dylan the first time and thinking, you're allowed to sing like that? That sounds like it should be, there should be a government department or something to stop that sort of thing happening. But it's just curious. I've been listening to a podcast recently with Judy Blume, and they asked a number of young women to ask Judy Blume questions, and every one of them prefaced their question by saying how important her books were to them. And I wondered if you guys caught up with Judy Blume, or was she before your...
No, she was when I was growing up, and I guess her books taught you about puberty and all the physiological things that happen, and I really enjoyed them, but they were American. It was a very different culture to growing up Asian in Australia, I guess. Yeah.
But I think Forever was, for me, it was a book that taught me that sex might actually be something to look forward to, which growing up in a strict Catholic school, I mean, I didn't think that was possible. So, yeah. Thank you, Judy. Now, sometimes it seems like YA publishing is now only interested in the highest stakes stuff, and sometimes you'll have a book that's labelled quiet, and that's quite a sort of damning word now. As an author, how do you talk yourself into feeling a story is the one you need to tell, if it's not a, explosions or suicide sort of book?
Well, I'm selfish. As much as I like to think about my readers, occasionally for me, I write the story that I feel I need to tell. And I like to say that I write really overly plotted, meandering nothingness. So it's like I'm really into heavily plotting, and everything needs to be there for a reason, but I also don't like it to seem like it is. And so I love those really, really quiet moments. So for me, the highlights of my life will be that the really quiet, coming home, sitting with mum and having really inappropriate conversations and things that don't really lead anywhere. And that, to me, when you put your whole life together, those are the moments that I remember. It's not the explosions, it's not the huge fights, it's not the will they, won't they sexual tension, because that, not between me and my mum, but always have to put it out there. There have been reviews. But yeah, it's that, at the end of the day, it's that warm, fuzzy, quiet stuff that's what I look back on my life and reflect on fondly. So that's what I like to preserve in my books.
Yeah. Alice, what about you? How do you tell yourself, this is the story I need to tell, and keep going through that long period of writing a book? Because it doesn't happen quickly, unfortunately.
Oh, no, it doesn't. I start off with characters. So for my last book, Laurinda, I started off with a character that was very much like the girls I knew when I was growing up in the western suburbs. These very determined girls who took on quite a lot of adult responsibilities for their parents who didn't speak much English. And then I started to think, because I visited a lot of schools throughout the years, about my own education. I also went to 5 different high schools, and so I'm almost 35 now, and when you're past your adolescence, when you look back on it, things fit into place that they never fitted in when you were going through puberty, because you're just going through feeling after feeling. So the one thing that struck out very clear to me in my educational experience was class as a theme. As a kid, you don't realise or notice class. As an adult, I see it so clearly between the schools I went to, from a state school to a Catholic school to a state selective school to a private school, from a co-educational school to an all-girls school, and vice versa. And so that's how Laurinda got its heartbeat, but mainly through characters, because if I were to write a book based on themes of identity and belonging and things like that, it would just fall flat. Yeah.
John, so many books. I mean,
well, excuse me, it's usually that a situation just grabs me and won't let go, and I find myself wandering around the streets thinking about it, or lying in bed at night thinking about it, or as I'm meant to be having a conversation with my wife or something, I'm distracted by thoughts about this situation, and it'll be a story or an anecdote or something I've read in the newspaper where it just won't let go, and weeks pass and I'm still thinking about it. And writing a book is a way of exploring the situation and trying to understand what's happening in it and what's happening to the people in it. and where it might lead to. So I remember a conversation with a girl whose brother was really violent, and she was scared to go home, and her parents wouldn't believe that he was violent when they weren't in the house. He was kind of waiting till they went out and then bashing her up. And I just couldn't lose that story. It just stayed with me, and I kept imagining what it might be like to be in a situation like that. So it's just trying to find answers to dilemmas in life, but also trying to get some empathy or imaginative understanding of what's going on in those sorts of scenarios.
Yeah. Let's talk about where this roadmap is trying to get us to, adulthood as a concept. I've read this article called The Death of Adulthood in American Culture by A.O. Scott. I'll just read this very short few lines to you. Grown people feel no compulsion to put away childish things. We can live with our parents, go to summer camp, play dodgeball, collect dolls and action figures, and watch cartoons to our heart's content. These symptoms of arrested development will also be signs that we are freer, more honest and happier than the uptight fools who let go of such pastimes.
Who wrote that?
That's A.O. Scott, The Death of Adulthood. And I just had a little look on the Australian Bureau of Statistics, which says that traditional milestones, such as moving away from home, moving in with a partner, or getting married, have been delayed until a little later in life. I think we can all see that happening. And then a Nielsen report in the US says that 80% of YA titles are bought by adults. Do you think that there is a problem with adults being such major consumers of YA?
No, but I think there's a hell of a problem with adults who won't grow up and who think that there's something attractive in saying, oh, I'm just a child at heart, or I'm never going to grow up. I think it's a really unattractive way to approach life and a really unhelpful way. American movies seem so often to be about adults who are acting like children and children who are acting like adults, and I don't find either role attractive. One of the worst films I've ever seen was that one about the psychiatrist who goes on holidays, and there's a patient who's so obsessed by him that he traces him to his holiday house and hangs around and excuse me, and basically haunts the psychiatrist's family. And does anyone know the name of the movie? Is it ringing a bell with anyone? What's it called? Oh yeah, What About Bob or something? Is that it? Yeah. And we were meant to see the patient's behaviour as attractive and the psychiatrist as a sort of humourless, boring, unattractive person because he didn't somehow enjoy this attention. And I just watched it in horror, thinking what a grotesque way for this patient to behave, and why are we supposed to find anything amusing in that? One of the things that bothers me most about childhood at the moment, or children, is the fear that they have of growing up and their fear of global warming, which is really troubling them at a very deep level, but also their belief that adulthood is not a very attractive gig and they don't want to get there. So when you say to them, what do you want to be when they grow up? They'll say things like, I don't want to grow up, I want to stay a kid. And that's become so common in the last 10 or 20 years. And I think that's very troubling. I think we need to present adulthood as a desirable state and as something to aspire to, and that the inevitable physical growth should be accompanied by an emotional and intellectual and social and spiritual growth, so that adulthood is arrived at in a positive frame of mind, so that people are happy to become adults and just excited about the possibilities that adulthood offers. Because I've got to say, for me, being an adult was a much better gig than being a kid or a teenager.
So, Will, what about you?
I have to preface this discussion by saying that I'm a 26-year-old male who still lives at home. So Arrested Development, yay. But the big thing is you look at the barriers to growing up. So for me, if I want to move out and, be an adult, I have to give up being an author, because there is no way I can be both. As much as I pay minimal rent at home and cook occasionally, if mum walks past my room and sees a bed isn't made, she'll either yell at me or do it herself, or, and I'll make sure I do it the next day. So there is that stage, and I actually tweeted about this yesterday, where it was, I started to thinking about, living with mum, this has infantilizing effects. And I thought, is that bad? Do I need to grow up? And then mum made chocolate crackles. And I'm like, this is the greatest thing ever. Sure, I have no freedom, but I have chocolate crackles. But that's the thing, to expand on what John said. 1 chocolate crackle tastes great. 3 in a row, have 6 or 7. Nah. But at the end of the day, I think there is also this, look at the adults we have as examples at the moment. Look at our politicians, look at our celebrities. I can't look at them without feeling deeply cynical about what it means to be an adult, what it means to have responsibility, where, the people who are responsible for our country believe in slogans or, and do things, on our behalf that we may not think are humane and things like that. And so when you look at that and then you think about, right, is that what adulthood is? Then what is youth? Looking at things positively and, being happy and, for me, I think growing up is realizing there is no one point when you grow up. Like, there are moments when, some of the best moments I've had with, I don't want to say older people, but they are older people, is that when you realise, when the mask comes down and you realise we're all sort of the same, some of us just look slightly older. And I think there is that, there is wisdom to growing older, and there is wisdom to being an adult, but at the same time, a lot of it is pretending. And yeah, I
think
know.
a lot of people feel that they're pretending to be an adult. I put this question out to Twitter as well. A lot of people said, I have children, I behave in an adult way, but when someone asks me to make an adult decision, I look around the room for an adult. But is this all bad? I mean, John, you seem to think it's sort of crisis
I'm just trying to process
point.
everything that Will said, and I'm thinking, firstly, you're looking at the wrong adults, so you need to look perhaps somewhere else than Canberra for the kind of adults you're talking about. But also that statement about how there's no kind of point at which you grow up, it's a process, that wasn't the case in many societies where they had rites of passage, which is the topic for today in a sense. And by not having those in our society, we have turned growing up into a very vague and ambiguous, ambivalent kind of state, where many societies had the wisdom to understand that you do have to draw a line and say, okay, put away childish things. It is now time for you to take on the responsibilities that we, the society, need you to take on. And we have moved a long way from that position.
And one of the things that really comes out with your work, John, is your belief in teenagers taking risks, physical challenges and independence.
Well, they'll take risks anyway, whether we allow them to or not. And what I would like to see them do is be adventurous and to take risks which are creative and will result in some sort of growth or acquisition of wisdom. I mean, you talked about old people becoming wiser. A lot of old people are really stupid. And we shouldn't... I think that Confucian idea that wisdom almost automatically vests in older people is not helpful either. But to have teenagers take risks which, other than driving down the wrong side of the road at 150 k's an hour, or taking drugs, or doing completely reckless and madly dangerous things, which I think is just a kind of inevitable consequence of them being kept in cotton wool and being protected so much in other aspects of their lives. And so as long as we have lollipop ladies standing there telling them when they can cross the road and when they can't, they will find ways to get out of the house at 3 a.m. and take risks that way, because they're not allowed to take them in other areas of their life.
And so how far can reading about this kind of risk-taking in a book, how far can that go in providing that map that we're talking about for teenagers?
Well, for me, especially when I read, it's like when you hear a book has been banned because of sexual content. And that always cracks me up, because it's like, yeah, kids can't Google what sex is, right? You're protecting them. But the thing is...
They can't have sex.
No, of course. But it's like, pornography and things like that are literally one click away. They could search 3 words and see a video, and they could see the geometry of it and, you know, the practical application of it. But when you look at the similar sort of thing explored in a book, you get the thematics of it, you get the emotion behind it, you see the impact of it on a person, and you learn from that experience and you grow from it. And that's one of the great things about reading, is that you're not learning, you know, yes, your English is improving and, you know, your use of vocabulary is improving, but you are learning from other people's experiences and you're learning from their mistakes. And, you know, there were so many times when I went to do something and there was a flash in my mind where it was a TV show that I'd seen or a film that I'd seen where I was like, oh, no, wait, I know where that path leads. And that sort of, I don't want to say talked me back from the edge, but it, you know, it did. A lot of my experiences I'd learned from that wisdom, if that makes sense.
So could it be a good thing that adults are reading a lot of YA if they're then able to talk about the same books that teenagers they work with or their own teenagers are reading?
Well, I think for some adults, they read YA because YA is allowed to be earnest and allowed to talk about things like the meaning of life without, you know, so the other day I was reading Jonathan Franzen's big whopping Purity, which is very clever and very well written, and I got through 10 or 20 pages and thought, this is really doesn't do it for me. The same way that a Sonia Hartnett book did it for me when I was 17 and then again when I was 27, because it's, you know, she distills something that's important about life. What I find interesting with this idea of young adulthood is I visited a lot of schools when a book I wrote a couple of years ago called Her Father's Daughter came out. So this was 6 years ago. This book deals with the Cambodian genocide. It doesn't, it's full-on Cambodian genocide. My father survived it. And some schools were wonderful, so they'd let me talk about the book. Other schools just wanted me to talk about genocide. They weren't going to touch the book. They weren't going to study the book. The girls weren't ready because they're only in year 9. And they didn't want me to show pictures of skulls. And so I had, you know, the teachers would warn me beforehand, don't tell that, you know, we've seen you talk before, don't talk about these certain things. And that was very, very eye-opening for me, that you had these 14-year-old girls who would, and I'd look around the audience and I'd see a couple of dark faces, so kids who probably came from Sudan and probably won scholarships, or I don't know what they were doing at that school. And I thought, if you won't let me talk about these topics, these students don't even know who's sitting right next to them. And that was very heartbreaking, that we coddle our students so much, we think they can't handle war, and they're reading the Hunger Games and, you know, swapping these books. And that's fiction, that's completely made up. Why is that okay? And they don't want to hear the suffering of their fellow author, their fellow friend. Yeah.
Well, the teenagers want to hear it, but the
teenagers
gatekeepers don't want them to hear it.
I've had parents call up
and the
radio
parents, I would imagine, would be the ones they're worried about.
This book, saying, oh, this book is not suitable for our teenagers because Alice Pung, she's a bit depressing. She wrote about depressing themes.
Yeah. Just to come back to Tomorrow When the War Began, and from the point of view of someone who read that book for the first time as an adult. That's me, by the way. When I read the book, I wasn't Ellie by any stretch of the mind. I was an adult and being held prisoner, and I was thinking of those teenagers as my daughter. And that was my sort of response to that book. So watching her and all the changes she goes through in that book made me think, as a parent, don't be a helicopter, because look what kids can do when you let them, really. So I think maybe adults reading YA can be a positive thing from that point of view as well. What do you think?
Yeah, there's many different reasons people read YA books, and you mentioned the fact that 90% or whatever of American YA books are bought by adults, but that might be that they're buying them for their kids. And I know I buy a lot of teenage novels for our kids, but They might be buying them because they're librarians or English teachers. There's lots of different reasons. But I do think in reading, one of the questions that constantly niggles at our mind as we read most books perhaps is, what would I do in that situation? Would I react like that? How would I handle this? And quite often as you're reading a book, you're thinking, I wouldn't do that. I'd handle it this way. And you feel that you might handle it better. But other times, it's very much a question of, could I survive this? A lot of my reading as a young person was about World War II, and reading about Gestapo tortures and people in Japanese prisoner of war camps. I was thinking, would I survive that? God, could I live on grass for weeks? Could I survive these kind of horrific ordeals, or would I try to kill myself, or would I just betray everybody rather than suffer anymore? So this powerful question is one reason I think reading can be so helpful for us in starting to form or become the adults that we are destined to be, that we start to get a sense of how we might measure up, and we start to ask ourselves these big questions and try to evaluate ourselves and get an idea of the kind of strengths that we have, or weaknesses as well, getting to know ourselves really.
I think the big thing with this is that the only adult books I read are the, if anyone's read them, the Terry Pratchett Witches Discworld books. And so I read that, I love the characters, I connect with them. That doesn't mean I aspire to be an elderly witch. But the thing is, when adults read young adult books, because they're reading about teenagers, immediately the discussion becomes, oh, you're infantilized. Oh, you're trying to recapture your youth. Maybe it's a compelling story. Maybe it connects with them. Maybe it tells them a truth that another book doesn't. Like, there are...
It's just really good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
For sure.
Now, there's a first time for everything, and lots of first times happen during these years. Will you please kick us off with a short passage about first kisses?
Great. This always goes well. As far as first kisses went, I couldn't have planned it any better. Candlelight and a crowd of thousands pushing us together. It was like I'd cut the last 5 minutes out of a movie and pasted them right into my life. I was about to have my first kiss. Maria pressed into me, not because someone had pushed her, but because she wanted to be closer. She tilted her head back. It was as clear a sign as any. I leaned in, our lips touched, her mouth opened. I almost fell in, but I recovered, mostly. My left calf was trembling, and I hoped to God she wouldn't notice me sweating. All the while, I was wondering if I was doing it right. What was I supposed to do with my tongue? And what about my hands? Was I supposed to hold her? I reached for her hips and stuck my tongue in. Pretty sure I poked a molar. It was warmer than I expected. I moved my tongue around a little bit more, and she pulled away abruptly and squinted up at me. Something clicked. How old are you? Her eyes darted across my face. The truth was unavoidable. 17, I conceded. She gasped. Oh, God. She cupped her hand over her mouth. Oh, God.
I loved that because I think remembering my teenage years, everything I did for the first time was just awful.
Yeah.
And I just had this feeling of doom, like I've mucked up the first time, so therefore that's it. That's it for kissing. I love the way that you use humour in that, and talk to us about using humour, especially in a book that it has some really sad moments in it as well.
I'm just very at peace with the fact that I live in a sitcom and everything about my life deserves a laugh track. Like, at some points I just sit there and go, really? This is happening? All right, then, we're going with this. I live a farce. Well, it was like my first kiss wasn't that. My first kiss was I was having an internet relationship, as you do at 14, and you're nervous about talking to anyone. And so a friend had set me up with a girl that he knew, and so we emailed, and then I was like, I had made the mistake of calling her my girlfriend, and we hadn't met. And my friend at the time was just like, you haven't met her? And so he waited until we had a pupil-free day at school and her school didn't, and he hauled me over to her school we snuck in the back way, and she was in the music department, and so we sent a student to go find her. She came out, and I had my first kiss in the middle of her school in front of the nunnery with my two best male mates sitting behind me laughing hysterically because I had no idea how to kiss. I had, both hands on the side of the cheeks doing,
That's perfect.
This is how they did it in Titanic, right? And it was all tongue and just really horrible. And then I was hauled away by a teacher. But I had that, and I had that laugh track because I had my friends stifling laughs and looking away and then looking back and just cackling wildly. And I was so embarrassed, and they kept bringing it up. They drew illustrations in class and showed the class. It was like a year 9 show and tell. But that, I wouldn't trade that experience for something perfect. I think those imperfect firsts, and it's sort of, that's the great thing about being a teenager. It's you just fumbling through the world and just slowly, you're making your first steps all over again, but as an individual in the world. And originally the first third was going to be called The Book of Firsts, but then I thought that is a terrible title. But so it's all about those firsts that you have, because I think that really defines that age group. And I think that's the appeal when adults look back and they read, young adult books, because you see parts of yourself. You may have grown out of them, but they remind us of what we felt like to be that age and to be uncertain and to be bumbling. There's an endearing quality to that, and it's that wide-eyed optimism mixed with you are really crap at this life thing that make these sorts of books appealing.
And teenagers use humour in all sorts of situations, don't they? I think we spoke, Will, about something really sad that happened to you in your teenage years. So
that best friend who followed me, who convinced me you have to go out and kiss this girl, he ended up passing away between year 10 and year 11 under the influence of drugs and alcohol and all that. So I remember that being a really dark period. I have the flashes of my melodrama, my crying, and I remember there was this one moment where it had just happened and I was crying to my mum, and I did that whole teenage. I literally said, "You don't understand what I'm going through, and no one understands this." And mum just blinks at me and goes, "Yeah, my brother died. I was a couple of years older than you." And I snapped back and I thought, oh wait, no, I'm not the only one who goes through this. And then after that, I sort of like, you know what, I'm not going to cry. Like, I still did cry a lot, but I remember that period also being the funniest period of my life, because whenever we made a joke, it shone through the darkness like a beacon, and it was that little bit of hope in the darkness. And if we could make an inappropriate joke at the funeral, we made it, and it was the funniest. His funeral was the funniest funeral I've ever been to, and it was in his spirit, and two, it just made it easier. And those jokes that we'd make that I'd sort of cringe about making now, but back then that was how we dealt with it, and that was how we propped each other up. And I think that's how teenagers deal with things. They deal with, if they're angry at you and they don't want to talk to you, they're not yelling at you, they're being sarcastic and they're making it a joke. And I think that humour is a really big defence mechanism. It's like a cushion on all that awkwardness. So,
and by using that in a book, and they see that, and that's a kind of feeling of acceptance that they get, that the way they deal with things is being portrayed in a novel. Yeah. Alice, let's talk about finding yourself in books. I loved this paragraph from Laurinda, if you wouldn't mind reading it, about a feeling of acceptance that she gets from a school friend. If you could just read that to us so that we can talk about the importance of finding yourself in books.
And here was the bitter paradox of adolescence. Alone I was most myself, most true, but the self that really mattered was the self that was visible, the self that could be shown to other people. And here was Katie proposing something radical, that she would support whichever self I needed to be out in the world.
And you have another great line, it's so much easier to be a hero when you know you belong. has it been difficult, do you think, for some readers to feel that they belong in YA?
I think it has. When I was growing up, you didn't have much diversity of background in YA, so you would read these books about white middle class or white working class people. And, we'll mention living at home at 26. I'm Chinese Cambodian. It's normal. It's not a stigma for us to live at home until we get married. And so you never recognised yourself in the book. But as a female, the other thing it does to you is you don't recognise your own face. So you don't realise that people of your race are considered attractive until you go to Japan or you go to China where everyone looks like you and you think, hey, because if you're not portrayed in YA literature, you feel invisible, or you feel like a token character that's always the wingman or the wingwoman to this hero of a book. Yeah.
And the consequence for the reader, a white reader who is very much represented in YA fiction, is that they never get to see those diverse characters either.
Yeah, well, we did actually. I lie. We had wonderful authors like Alan Bale write about Cambodian boys who escape from terrible things. But those weren't our narratives. They weren't Asian Australian narratives. They were survival narratives, and they were stories to show maybe tropes of courage. Not necessarily, an Asian Australian teenager who buys a car for $200 and kits it out for $2,000, and the normal adolescent experience. When I edited a book called Growing Up Asian in Australia, I got these reactions from reviewers. They said, I never expected to love this book as much as I did, but I could recognise myself in these stories. These weren't Asian Australian characters. I mean, these weren't Asian Australian reviewers. They were of all different backgrounds. And I said, of course, everyone goes through adolescence differently, but everyone goes through adolescence exactly the same.
Hi, my name's Kate. I like reading YA. I was just wondering, if we accept that most YA is written by adults, why the discomfort that adults would read it?
Yeah, I mean, there are different reasons people write it, I think, and I know Paul Jennings and Maurice Leitzman talk about the 11-year-old inside them who writes their books for them, in a sense. I don't feel that way at all. I think I write about that period of life because it was the most intense and difficult period of my life. I was in a state of chaos, and I had nowhere that was safe, and the first safe place I found was a psychiatric hospital when I was about 18 or 19, and I think writing about it is a way of my trying to deal with that experience in that part of my life. And so there's a kind of, I hate to use the word therapy, but there is a bit of a therapeutic approach to it. But I'm also hoping that readers who are experiencing similar angst might identify with the situations I describe and the situations I explore and find something there that might give them strength. So there's a bit of a missionary zeal about it too.
For me, it's I kept every story and novel that I wrote through high school, and so I still have that. This is what 14-year-old William actually wanted to read, and I read through it, and it is so vulgar, and it is so just obscene, and I look at it, and that's like me now. I'm thinking, oh yes, I write the book that I wanted to read when I was 15, 16. I'm not at all, because I have proof of it, and it makes me cringe. So there is that part of me where there is a more adult side of me that's like, no, I'm going to temper this. And look, a good story is a good story. Who cares who's reading it? Let's represent different teenagedoms. Let's look at different teenage experiences. Let's explore that. Let's have fun. And yeah, let's just stop bagging people for reading different kinds of books. Stop bagging people for liking books about vampires. Stop bagging people for liking books about war. And just, they're reading. let them read, and if there are adults that are reading it, that's great, because you know what? That means adults are buying it. That means publishers are putting more money into it, and that means that the teenagers that want to see themselves in books, that is being subsidised by the adults who are buying it. So that's how I choose to look at it.
As long as publishing YA doesn't change to suit the adult reader,
Exactly.
but it always keeps that teenage reader in mind.
That's why the adults are reading it, isn't it? Because the form it's in now. If it becomes like an adult book, then why aren't they reading the adult books?
Absolutely, yeah. Another question?
There's a recent book out by a UK author, Louise O'Neill, called Asking For It. I'm not sure if anyone here has read it, which is basically about a young high school girl dealing with the sort of aftermath of sexual assault. I work in a bookshop, and recently a colleague read it and called all the other stores and said, get it out of YA and put it into adult, because it's way too graphic and the themes are obviously very dark and very full on. And I wonder what you guys have to say about dealing with issues like, sexual assault and domestic violence that, a lot of young adults may have already dealt with or will deal with at some point, without sort of putting off parents who know that the content might be very graphic for them, if that makes sense.
Well, it happens, so I don't understand why you would not let young adults read about this. If it's happening to them, I think it would be very comforting if they found a book that dealt with these things. If it's not happening to them, it would give them more insight into maybe their friends who are dealing with this kind of thing. So I grew up I went to, even in primary school, I went to a rough primary school when there was a girl who used to get taken out to counselling sessions, and no one ever told us what that was about. And I didn't have much insight as a kid with dealing with her. I reckon if I understood these things better, if someone had explained it, or if a book, which is the best tool for explaining things because you don't have to sit them down, they can't, interrogate you. You can't say the wrong thing. I think the book is the best way to talk about dark themes.
Will, John?
I remember years ago a librarian in Sydney describing a girl who was borrowing a lot of books from their library, and she said to this girl one day, why do you like reading so much? And the girl said, because books tell me what I want to know without asking me why I want to know it. And I thought that was such a great answer, because if you try and have a conversation about these topics with an adult, their antennae will start quivering and they'll be like, why do you want to know? Why are you asking? And is this to do with... But books don't get in the way of your acquisition of knowledge.
Will, would you worry about any particular theme in a
I
YA
wouldn't
book?
worry about it, because there are the publishers that worry about that anyway. There are the gatekeepers there. They walk through it, and if there is something sensitive, so say in the first third I wanted to look at, a boy who is same-sex attracted who wanted to have casual sex for his first time. And so if I pitch it as that at a school, I probably wouldn't be let into any schools. And I've had teachers tell me, oh, don't talk about that scene. You cannot talk about that scene. And the problem was, so I went into the school and I was like, okay, I'm not going to talk about that scene, even though the girls had all read the book and knew about it. And so I was like, and so I asked them, who's your favourite character? All the girls said it was the gay character. And I'm like, all right, okay, what was your favourite scene? And they were like, oh, when he talked through his first time. And I looked around and I just saw the teachers withdraw into their seats. And I was just like, all right, well, what was it? What was it about that? And then, it was a girls' school, so none of them were, men who were attracted to men. But they were like, I understood my friend Tom. And I sat there and I thought, that's why we write, and that's the reaction that's why we talk about those difficult things, because it helps them understand the world. It doesn't have to be about them. It doesn't have to reflect their experience, but it adds to their empathy. And it's that little bit, it's things that we're uncomfortable talking about and things that we're uncomfortable mentioning. Those are the things that we want to talk about, and those are the things that we're better for getting out in the open. It's like when you have a secret and you tell someone and then you realise, wow, that secret actually meant nothing. But when you are keeping it inside of you, it just builds and builds and builds and builds. And it's the same with things that are unspoken and unsaid. And, you know, kids can handle, you know, a lot more than we give them credit for.
You know what, Will? It's so funny that the girls love that scene, because there's this whole trope on the internet of teenage girls writing about One Direction, you know, the band with their hairstyle in One Direction. They're writing about the characters making out with each other, and all the whole band members are all men, and you can Google them, and these 12 to 14-year-old girls exploring their sexuality for the first time by writing about Harry and Liam getting it off on each other. I think, hey, that's great.
That seems like a safe place to sort of work that all out.
Erotic fan fiction, yeah.
That's what it's called. And you think teenage sexuality is so interesting, isn't it? Yeah.
So if we don't write it, they will.
Yes, it's true.
Right.
I had kind of the opposite experience. I wrote a book called Secret Men's Business, and as a result I got invited to some schools to talk to audiences of boys about issues of growing up and issues of being male. And I went to one well-known high school not far from here, and when I got there, a male teacher said to me, I hope you're going to talk to the boys about washing under their foreskins and making sure. And he went on at some length about how this needed to be said. And I was completely blindsided and said, well, I don't know, I have to think about that. And I went towards the auditorium, and I was just off stage waiting to go on to begin this talk. And he popped up again beside me and said, now don't forget the foreskins. And by then I had an answer ready, and I said, I don't think it's appropriate for me as a stranger to them to talk about something so intimate. And so I didn't talk about it, which must have disappointed him terribly, but it was quite grotesque and quite creepy, really. But but even the whole, in the end I stopped accepting those invitations, because not because of that, but the more I thought about it, the more I thought, it's not right that I, as a stranger, should come and talk to them. It should be the elders of their tribe who talk to them, not the fathers, because when a father has a conversation with his son about sex, the father is talking about having sex with the boy's mother, which is unbearable for the boy to hear. And so it needs to be the uncles or the other males in the village or the tribe, which other societies understood perfectly, at least at an unconscious level. So, but it's not right, I think, that a stranger should come in and start having these conversations with boys, or women with girls for that matter. It should be done by people who are known to those young people and who are trusted by them.
I think we need another question.
I do like the story that the great Japanese film director Kurosawa told about the earthquake in, was it Kobe, where tens of thousands of people were killed. And the day after the earthquake, his brother took him into the city, and he described how they had to avoid certain bridges because they couldn't cross because of the crush of dead bodies, and there were intersections where they had to kind of skirt around because of all the bodies. And yet that night he slept really well, and he said to his brother in the morning, how could I sleep so well after what we saw yesterday? And his brother said, it's what you are afraid to look at that has the power to hurt you. And that has always stayed with me. And about 2 years ago, when a parent at our school had a leg amputated after a motorbike crash, he came in to talk to all the kids who were aged from prep to year 10 about his accident and the aftermath. And the kids wanted to see the stump of his leg, which was bound up in a bandage. And he looked at me and he said, it's not very pretty, you know, it's a pretty horrifying sight. And I remembered that Kurosawa story, and I said, I think it's better to have them see your leg than to have them imagine what it might look like, which would be quite possibly worse. And so he unwound the bandage, and the kids gathered around, and they were intensely curious and absolutely fascinated, and asked him endless questions, but there was not a sign of any revulsion or horror or fear in their faces. They were just absolutely fascinated, and it was a really worthwhile experience. It was a really kind of lovely moment in many ways. So it just reinforced my belief that confronting things, looking at them honestly and looking at them searchingly and engaging with them in a profound way is usually going to be worthwhile.
And they'll stop turning the pages of a book if they find something that's not right. I mean, I think teenagers are great at doing that self-censorship if they feel that's enough.
It's very common to hear a kid say it was too old for me when they explain why they didn't continue reading a book.
Any more questions from the audience? Well, all right. I'll have another question then. One more. Got one more. So if you could recommend a new or newish work of YA fiction to your teenage self, what would you recommend to them? From things from the last sort of 5 to 10 years, maybe.
I would say Everything Beautiful by Simone Howell. That book for me, it was, this girl is sent to a Christian camp, and so I thought, this might be fun. They're just going to pay out God and religion. And then I sat there, and she didn't go that road at all. And it was just a really beautiful story about just being a kid, and it was just really beautifully written, and I don't really want to say any more about it. Just go read it.
Teenage Will would have liked that.
Yeah.
John?
I'd say perhaps The Dead I Know, or anything by Scott Gardner. It's a book which is written with great delicacy and great sensitivity, and he goes into territory which many people might find fearful or disturbing, but he does so in a way which doesn't leave you afraid or disturbed. It's a really beautifully judged book.
I agree, it's gorgeous.
I would recommend Zack and Mia by A.J. Betts, who is a Perth writer. So a lot of young adults have read this book called The Fault in Our Stars by John Green, which is a wonderful book. But the kids in that book talk in paragraphs. They're very articulate and they're very deep, whereas A.J. Betts has worked in a hospital. She teaches terminally ill children and young adults, and it's written from her direct experience, and also it's a very Australian book. Yeah, so they run a farm called the Happy Olive, and it's just lovely.
Yeah, it's gorgeous. Great choices, guys. I think we have
What about
run
you,
out
Emily?
of time. Oh, me?
Yep.
Oh, my God. I didn't prepare that. Mine would be Wildlife by Fiona Wood. Because it's an experience that I have never had. It's a term spent in an outdoor camp. Wow, I would have absolutely loved to read that as a teenage girl. And everything she says about friendship and your first time, that would have done me a lot of good, I think. So that would be mine. Now, we've run out of time. I'd like to say thank you so much to you for being a great audience, and would you please join me in thanking our wonderful panel.